Welcome to the broadcast. Tonight, a reaction to the President's speech on national television tonight about Haiti and Iraq. Bob Newhart will be here, and political satirist Mark Russell. We begin with Iraq. Today, the Iraqis announced that they were pulling back troops that were on the Kuwaiti border. The President spoke tonight, and here is what he said.
We will not allow Saddam Hussein to defy the will of the United States and the international community. Iraq announced today that it will pull back its troops from the Kuwait border. But we're interested in facts, not promises, in deeds, not words. And we have not yet seen evidence that Iraq's troops are in fact pulling back. We'll be watching very closely to see that they do so. Our policy is clear. We will not allow Iraq to threaten its neighbors or to intimidate the United Nations as it ensures that Iraq never again possesses weapons of mass destruction.
Joining me now are Judith Miller, on leave from the New York Times and a fellow at the 20th Century Fund, and Laurie Mylroie, an associate at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Miller and Mylroie co-authored the 1990 book Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Gulf. It is now in paperback. Mylroie is a former fellow at Harvard University, and she's finished a follow-up book on Hussein. Also joining us, New York Magazine's political columnist Jacob Weisberg. He has written one of the complimentary pieces about President Clinton and his foreign policy, appeared in New York Magazine recently. Welcome. Jacob, I begin with you. What did you think of what the President said tonight, and does this confirm your instincts about him as a...
I should add that my defense of the President was more based on his domestic policy, and defense of his foreign policy I took basically more of an intellectual exercise.
Your argument was essentially he kept his promise to the American people in terms of what he campaigned on in '92.
That's right, in domestic policy. And in foreign policy, I said that while screwing up some of the small things, he had gotten the big things basically right.
Big things being Russia and China.
Russia, denuclearization, Korea so far, China. But I do think in political terms, this provocation from Saddam is a slow one over the plate for the President. It's a tailor-made opportunity to show the tough-mindedness which everybody has thought was missing from his foreign policy. And judging by his speech tonight, I thought he did that very well. I think the decision is somewhat obvious. He had to send troops. I don't think that was a tough call. But that said, he did it very well. He sent a very clear signal.
How about Haiti?
Well, I think there is a very thin veneer of public support for Haiti. It's going very well. It's going much better than anyone has expected. There have been no American casualties, no American troops really. I think there's been one injury. No one has been killed. The generals are leaving early, and it looks like the transition back into power for Aristide is going to be very smooth. And I think what Clinton was trying to do tonight was partly to capitalize on that success so far to try to build more public support for this mission when the going gets tougher, as it inevitably will at some point.
Laurie, you had a piece in Newsweek this week that's on the stand called He's Back, Saddam's Dangerous Game, in which you talk about the possibility of Iraqi-sponsored terrorism in the United States. I want to get to that in a minute. But first, tell me what you make of what Saddam is doing on the border of Kuwait.
Saddam is in trouble, and he took a decision about the 27th of September to force a lifting of sanctions, to cause such pain that the United States will be obliged to go along with the lifting of sanctions. They began to threaten the United States with acts of terrorism. There were blood-curdling threats in the Iraqi press. Does America understand what it means for that every Iraqi is a missile that could cross two countries and cities?
That was the exact quote that the Iraqi official said.
That was in Saddam's son's rag called Babel on the 29th of September. And I am curious what that means, what they intend by that.
I want to come back to that for a second, because you're suggesting that they're saying it's not just our troops that could do damage to America. But what's he doing, and why is he doing it now? And clearly it is being argued that this movement of troops will impede getting sanctions removed rather than encourage it.
Yes, I think it will. And once again, Saddam is proving that he's the Inspector Clouseau of diplomacy. In everything he touches, everything he tries to do, except he's managed to survive. And I think this latest gambit is an effort to do just that, because I think he figured out, Charlie, that he was not going to get the sanctions lifted, despite sending Tariq Aziz here in the last couple of weeks to lobby hard, lobby the French and the Russians. And therefore he had to do something even more spectacular, even more dramatic to get our attention. Well, he's certainly done that. But he's also gotten himself into a situation where I think his own Republican Guard is exposed. These troops are not dug in as they were in round one of the Persian Gulf War, and therefore he's had to move them back, use them, lose them, or expose them. So I think it's going to be a very tense few days until we see exactly what he's going to do. He's moved his troops back. He hasn't moved the ammunition back, and he hasn't moved the food back, which is most important.
How badly are the sanctions hurting him, and what threat are they to him?
I think they're hurting a lot. I mean, clearly we wouldn't see this kind of desperate act unless they were really hurting. And if he didn't get the sanctions lifted this time, it would be 3 more months of shortages and no income, and I think he feels exposed. That's why he's doing what he's doing, and that's why I think we just have to keep the pressure on.
And it accomplishes what? Let's assume the objective is to remove the sanctions because they're hurting him. But suppose is it somehow an effort to communicate to the Iraqi people saying, I know you're, to somehow diffuse pressure on his regime?
I think it's an effort to divert attention from the shortages that everybody's now feeling. I mean, when you cash a $100 bill and you get a stack of dinars about as tall as Laurie Mylroie sitting at the table, you know that there's a problem. And, you know, these sanctions are not like the sanctions against Libya. Libya has been able to sell its oil. These are really tough sanctions. Eventually, we knew they were going to have some effect, and I think we're seeing that.
One of the things I read is that he's become even more paranoid than he's been, and that he no longer even trusts the people in the small village where he grew up, and the only people that he trusts now are his immediate family, and we're not so sure about that.
He's cornered, and I think he's very dangerous. I think those Iraqi threats have to be taken seriously. He has other options than invading Kuwait. He can attack the north, and he can commit acts of terrorism in the United States like the World Trade Center bombing again.
Oh, you keep coming back to that. Let's go ahead and talk to that, because, I mean, it was a thing that got a lot of attention and was highlighted by Newsweek. What's the point that you're making? How would they do it, and what's the evidence that they had any connection with the World Trade Center bombing?
I've written a book about that, which I consider the sequel to Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Gulf. Saddam's Revenge.
The World Trade Center bombing, the untold story, Saddam Hussein's revenge.
Okay, when you look at that bomb, it was huge. It was over half a ton of explosives, and they made their own nitroglycerin, which was a trigger, and they had hydrogen gas cylinders on top of it. It was not done only by the half-witted followers of Sheikh Omar. When a bomb like that goes off anywhere else in the world, people immediately say it's state-sponsored.
Your idea is it was intended to topple the two towers, one against the other?
That is what the judge said at the time of the sentencing of the defendants, and that is what the investigators concluded, because the van itself was parked up against a wall, the retaining wall of the North Tower.
You say there is an Iraqi sleeper in the United States. I mean, how do you know this?
If you read the courtroom documents very carefully, and especially the telephone bills that were introduced into evidence, you see that there was someone who up until December was using his real name for the apartment that he lived in Brooklyn on his telephone bill. Beginning in January, he takes a short form of his girlfriend name and lists his telephone number under her name. He changes the number. Beginning in February, he takes a room in Manhattan and lists it under yet another name. There was someone whom the police know virtually nothing about. An ABC correspondent was telling me they don't even know. He came in the last stages of the operation to supervise it, but this Nightline reporter was telling me the police don't even know where he stayed. So, well, I know someone who had 2 apartments in February '93, and I venture that this person could well have stayed in one of those.
Judy, I know this person was a scientist, you say, with an expertise in genetic engineering, this sleeper?
The sleeper is a scientist with expertise in genetic engineering. He had 2 residences in February '93, in which it would seem that yet another person about whom the police know virtually nothing. It came from abroad to supervise the operation at its last stage, and this person would appear to have stayed in one of those two residences.
Judith?
I think there's a lot that we still don't know about the World Trade Center bombing, but I think we shouldn't, I'm not sure how it affects what policy the United States should now adopt towards Saddam. I mean, the problem is, what does one do? What does the United States do? What does the Clinton administration do about Saddam? And the threat of terrorism is always with us. It was with us with Libya. It was with us with Sudan. It's been with us with Syria when we put Syria on the terrorist list. I think these are just risks you have to live with and go on conducting your foreign policy.
What do you make of the response of the president so far? I mean, is it likely to send the appropriate message to Saddam?
I think sending 30,000 plus troops sends the appropriate message to Saddam. I mean, I think that he has gotten the message. The issue is, what do we do now to prevent Saddam from jerking us around from 3 months from now when he feels lonely, saying, okay, I think I'll move the Republican Guard. Well, there is military action, which at the moment I do not favor. That's the part of the problem. I mean, who do you hit? What point are you making? And can you do it legally? I think there's a lot to be said for keeping the coalition together if the United States can do that.
Is the coalition together?
For the moment, they are.
I mean, the Saudis are with us.
And God bless Saddam Hussein. He has helped bring the coalition back together again in a way that American pressure could never have done.
But probably the Turks are not as friendly as they might have, as they were
I think that,
at the time that Bush was putting together
the
coalition.
There has been, I think the diplomatic word is erosion.
Yeah.
But clearly, I think that we've bought ourselves some time. Now we need to develop some policy options, and I know that that's what's going on in Washington.
Developed right now, and
right now.
Under consideration is,
well,
sources tell you, under consideration is some kind of military action, perhaps, even if he does pull the troops back.
I think that is always an option. I do not think it is one that is being considered very seriously at this point.
Would we endanger our relationship with our friends in the Arab world if, in fact, we use this movement of troops as a pretense for striking against Saddam?
Exactly, Charlie. That's why I don't think we're going to do it. Now, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait would very much, at this stage, I think, like us to do that. But there's Egypt to think about. There is Jordan to think about. There's a peace process to think about. And I think there are other options available to us which will be more attractive as people calm down and think about things. For example, just informing Saddam that if he ever does this again, moves his troops to the border in such a provocative fashion, whereas his, quote, peaceful intentions, as the UN resolution says, are likely to be challenged, that at that point the coalition will take military action. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that will happen.
It's my understanding that also he was that some of the allies wanted us to begin to remove the sanctions. Yes, obviously the Russians are not our allies, but in fact they are our new friends, and they wanted to because they want to use the money that they would get from buying oil. I mean, they want, right?
I had a talk with the French ambassador to the UN. France also would like to do a little business with Iraq. Right. I heard the same lecture from him.
That really, I think, has strategically changed. And I think what people are not appreciating is what this means is the United States must have as a goal the removal of Saddam Hussein in fairly short order.
We do. We must, you're saying?
We must. But the president today said that Saddam Hussein must comply with all the UN resolutions. Now, what does he mean by that?
But Laurie, it comes back to what I think is the unfortunate legacy of the last war, which was a job that was unfinished. We had an international coalition in place, we had domestic support, we had full-scale provocation, and partly because that war was so successful so quickly, in 100 hours we had pushed Saddam back and had suffered relatively few casualties. I think the temptation for George Bush to quit while he was ahead was very, very great. But I think what we would have known if we had been shrewder about Saddam and observed his past actions more closely was that he would be back. He is someone who is often erratic, who often does things that are counterproductive, but he will push as far as he can possibly get and only stops short of suicide. And to me, it's an inevitability that until he is deposed or killed, that he will be pushing the edge of the envelope, that he will be provoking a crisis somewhere
Yes,
or
but
somewhere.
the issue is, how is that going to happen? How will he be deposed? At this point, that's a very important event in the Arab world.
How will he be deposed?
How he will be deposed. If he is deposed, if it is seen that the United States is crushing him in an imperialistic fashion, it's not going to help us, especially when all of the ingredients are now in place for the Iraqi army itself to move.
I'm not as expert as you on this subject, but it does seem to me that last time the danger of an Arab reaction against the United States because of our actions was really oversold last time, at the time of the Gulf War.
I don't think so. I think, in retrospect, it was a very difficult call for the Bush administration. I really do believe, having walked the streets of Cairo, that if the bombing had gone on for a few more days, I really don't know what would have happened
After
inside
it had gone on
Egypt.
for weeks.
Yes, precisely, because it was, as our own military said, a turkey shoot after a while. It was very, very unseemly. And we still don't know to this day who will take over in Iraq.
But
But in the end, that's the problem that worries me.
I think it has to worry people. See, it is not
Judy,
inconceivable
but you're stuck in a time warp 2 years ago when faced with these problems, and particularly if you leave aside the turkey shoot at the end of the war, but think of what happened in March of '91 when the population rose up against Saddam, and there was this concern, what happens if someone else replaces Saddam? And they made the decision.
Not to support the Shiites.
The Shiites, the Kurds, the people, and now they're stuck with Saddam. Now, what I'm trying to suggest when I say Saddam was about behind the World Trade Center bombing, the object was to topple the tower and kill tens of thousands of people. If he tried once, he's going to try again.
Okay, but let me just, I know that, but let me just come back to that point. Do you have evidence that Saddam was behind the World Trade?
Yes, and it's in my book.
All right.
Read my book.
But Charlie,
is your book out?
It could be out very soon.
Okay, so I couldn't read it now because it's not out. Okay, and I have galleys.
Okay.
take the manuscript.
All right.
But what could be worse? I mean, whether he's responsible for the World Trade Center bombing or not, what government in Iraq could be worse than Saddam's
a government
regime?
that
Good
pursues
point.
exactly his policy, but a government that is able to sell oil, to rebuild a military establishment, that could be a lot worse.
I guess, I tell you what government many people think would be worse, would be a government that's so weak it would be vulnerable to Iran, would be.
I'm not as worried
You're no
about
longer
that.
worried about
I think
that because Iran is now weaker.
has its own problems.
Okay, I agree.
And, let's not forget that it was Iran that was attacked by Iraq. Iraq started the war against Iran. No, but I do
that
think
has always, before Iran has become, in a sense, weaker, apparently, in the last several years, in the last year or so, the argument always was that it would be vulnerable to some kind of fundamentalism, and that was the reason that they wanted a stable Saddam.
Yes, that was
A
a
stable
good,
Iran,
that was
and
a
he was
good
the only
reason
person.
up until the time that the Iran-Iraq war ended. At that point, it was time to reevaluate the policy, and no one ever did. Once again, that was on the Bush administration's watch. But you know, Charlie, this issue is very, very important.
Which
Getting
issue?
rid of Saddam. I want to get rid of Saddam as much as the next person.
Do you think that the
but
president...
there are ways to do it and not to do it.
But you are saying the administration at this hour is considering ways to get rid of Saddam.
I don't
take
think,
this opportunity
no,
to
I am not
consider it.
saying that. I'm saying they are looking at ways that will maximize the pressure on Saddam so that he will go.
Well,
and hopefully the United States won't be blamed.
We've been down that road before. But,
I'm out of time. Make this in 20 seconds.
At the end of the Gulf War, I think we were too concerned about the moral responsibility that followed from getting rid of him. We would have had to, in effect, been the trustee of Iraq and responsible for any government came to power, not just that it be better, but that it be democratic.
Well, I mean, we face a lot of other issues in terms of how many Americans might be. If you went to Baghdad, that would be a lot of American casualties, and you had not
And
had
that
that,
is still a problem.
and that is still an
That is
issue
still a
if you go into
potential
Baghdad. I thank all of you. Pleasure. We look forward to reading this manuscript. Thank you very much. Thank you, Judith. Great to see you. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
In the State of the Union address last night, the president identified Iraq as one of those states that might have hostile intentions against the United States and might be trying to develop nuclear weapons, suggesting there may be a new diplomatic offensive against them. Author Laurie Mylroie is here now. She joins us to talk about her new book, The War Against America, where she makes a case that the attacks on the World Trade Center last September and those in 1993 can be linked to Saddam Hussein. She argues that the Iraqi dictator is the single greatest threat to U.S. security. I am pleased to have her here to talk about Iraq and its threat. We've got a new forward here, a new afterward, and what else?
New introduction, new conclusion, and forward by former CIA Director Jim Woolsey.
Who pretty much agrees with many of your conclusions.
He's been a big supporter.
John Milton, Paradise Lost, Book 1, 105 to 09. What though the field be lost, all is not lost, the unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome. Why'd you choose that?
That is Satan in hell as he plots his revenge. And the original title of the book, Study of Revenge, came from that piece of poetry. And I meant to suggest that Saddam was like Satan in hell, plotting his revenge.
The one thing that people, when I mention your name to people, is they say, you know, the next thing out of their mouth is that she's obsessed by Saddam Hussein. Obsessed is the word they use. Are they right?
No. The question is not me and my sunny disposition. The question is the evidence as it is presented in that book.
Yeah.
And that's what should be answered.
The evidence, and the most conclusive evidence is what?
Yeah, there are lots of reasons why New York FBI, specifically Jim Fox, at the time of the 1993 investigation into the Trade Center bombing, thought it was Iraq. The most conclusive piece of evidence revolves around the identity of the mastermind. He's now in a jail in Colorado. He came into the United States on an Iraqi passport in the name of Ramzi Youssef.
Yeah.
That's how he's known. He left the country the night of the bombing on a Pakistani passport in the name of Abdul Basit Karim. There really was such an individual, Abdul Basit Karim, a Pakistani, born and raised in Kuwait. And there is a file on Abdul Basit in Kuwait's Interior Ministry, and it was tampered with to create a false identity for Yusuf. It has, among other things, Yusuf's fingerprints in them. Mm-hmm. So it becomes a key question, the real identity of Ramzi Youssef, because almost no one says that Ramzi Youssef is his real name. The key question is his real identity Abdul Basit Karim or something else? And if it is something else, and I spoke with Abdul Basit's teachers in Britain, because he studied there after high school, they are firmly convinced that their student is not the individual who masterminded the Trade Center bombing in 1993. If they are two different people, that becomes the smoking gun on Iraq, because reasonably, only Iraq could have tampered with a file in Kuwait's Interior Ministry while it occupied Kuwait.
And that's when it happened, or did we know?
Presumably, the tampering of the file would have occurred during the Iraqi occupation.
And how long were they there? I've forgotten. Was they there for more than 3 weeks, month?
Well, they were there for 6 months. The invasion was April 1990, and they left Kuwait at the end of February 1991. They had 6 months to do what they wanted.
And did they tamper with lots of files, as far as we know?
They may have tampered with other files. There's a convicted conspirator with Yusuf in the plot in 1995 to bomb a dozen U.S. airplanes in the Philippines. The fellow's name is Abdul Hakim Murad, and he claims to be a Pakistani born and raised in Kuwait.
How do you think this will be resolved?
Well, one possibility is that we will target Iraq in an upcoming phase in the war on terrorism and get rid of Saddam and his regime.
Oh, is that what's going to happen if they target Iraq?
Well, that's also under debate. Some people in Washington don't want to say that Iraq was involved in terrorism.
Now, who is that?
Oh, that's the State Department and the CIA. One has to...
Well, but because they don't want to say it because they don't believe it, or they don't want to say it because they think it's counterproductive to their efforts?
One has to understand what happened. Bill Clinton made an enormous mistake regarding terrorism and regarding Iraq. He did not want to hear that there was a problem in Iraq so serious that he had to deal with it in decisive fashion. And the bureaucracies, including the State Department and the CIA, accommodated him.
Do you think that was true? I mean, you're saying lots of things that lots of people would want to challenge, especially Bill Clinton. I mean, you think that because what? I mean, he clearly wanted to get rid of, whether he did it or not. His argument is the following: yes, we wanted to get rid of Osama bin Laden, of course. Look what we did. I mean, we bombed him, and some of the critics will say, well, that was a kind of, he did that to detract attention from some domestic problems, scandal problems, but nevertheless, they did it, and they missed him by an hour or so, according to a lot of sources, that they missed him for whatever reason, if in fact Osama was there. So he clearly went after him. He did not have, as you well know, the same kind of circumstance that George Bush has today. Pakistani had a different attitude then, and there wasn't a kind of united effort to do something as there was following September 11th.
Clinton wasn't really willing to make a very serious effort to deal with these problems. He did them in half measures. If they worked, he would have been delighted. But when they did not work, then he did not aggressively pursue the matter.
For whatever reason, because he didn't. But are you suggesting that he didn't do it because he was distracted by other things, or he didn't do it because he didn't care, or he didn't do it because he didn't believe?
I couldn't possibly explain Clinton's motives, but the consequence.
But they're important, wouldn't you think?
You should have Bill Clinton on here and ask him.
I'm trying very hard, I promise you, Laurie. But I mean, here's what I'm getting at. It is that I mean, your argument goes to the notion that this evidence was there, and the administration looked the other way.
Right, because in June of 1993, when Clinton hit Iraqi intelligence headquarters,
right,
he said publicly that that was for the attempt
on Bush's life.
Right. But he meant it for the terrorism in New York as well. They were aware of the suspicions of New York FBI regarding the Trade Center bombing. Sudanese intelligence was involved in the second conspiracy, which targeted the UN, the federal building here, and 2 tunnels. And Clinton believed that when he struck Iraqi intelligence headquarters, it would deter Iraq from all future acts of terrorism and warn off countries like Sudan and Iran from any terrorism. So he dealt slyly with the question of state involvement in the terrorism and publicly with the criminal question of the guilt or innocence of those involved. And that's how people came to believe there's a new kind of terrorism that doesn't involve states, when that wasn't the case at all.
Listen to this, the back of your book. Laurie Mylroie was an advisor on Iraq to the 1992 presidential campaign of Bill Clinton. She is an adjunct fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and taught at Harvard and the U.S. Naval War College, etc. So, co-authored with Judith Miller, Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Gulf, written for the Post, Journal, Times, Newsweek, and other national magazines. Ramzi Yousef, if you tried to see him, have you tried to go out there and interview him?
No, I haven't. I guess because I expected I would not get a positive request. What I have tried to do and continue to think should be done is to bring the people who knew Abdul Basit Karim to prison to meet Ramzi Yousef, and then we would get very important information.
But why don't you want to go out there and talk to him?
I would like to do that. I haven't made the effort because I know others have tried and they've gotten nowhere.
Nobody has seen him other than 1 or 2 early reporters.
That's correct. The one person who interviewed him was
Nagita Durgam.
That's right.
Right. And she's the only one I know. Did someone else interview him?
No.
Yeah. Has he seen anybody? Has he said anything about this war? Because he's out there with some notorious people, as you know.
That's right, but he has said virtually nothing. At his sentencing hearing, he gave an explanation for his terrorism, which was Israel and how it treats the Palestinians and U.S. sanctions on Iraq, and that's virtually all he said.
Does he seem to, I mean, you think he is whom?
I think he is neither Ramzi Yousef nor Abdul Basit Karim, which is also the opinion of the judge in the trial, Judge Duffy. Said at his sentencing hearing, we don't even know your name.
And the judge does not believe he was the man whose passport he was traveling under?
Evidently not.
Yeah, okay. Woolsey believes what?
I hesitate to speak for him. I'm sympathetic to my ideas.
But that's general, but that's too broad and general. Sympathetic to my ideas. What does he believe?
At one point, I think Jim Woolsey did believe that Ramzi Yousef and Abdel Basit were two different people. He wrote that. He went to Swansea, met with the same people I had done, 6 years afterwards, and they told him the same thing. And he did a much better interview than me because he's more experienced, was more precise, got them to be more specific about the ways in which their student was different from Ramzi Yousef. And that includes the height. Ramzi Yousef is 6 feet tall. Abdel Basit Karim was 5'8" at most.
4 inches.
4 inches. The teachers are very firm on that Abdel Basit Karim was not as tall as Ramzi Yousef.
What would you like to see, or what do you think the administration should do? What's the appropriate policy recommendation about Iraq?
Unless we eliminate Saddam and his regime, just like we eliminated the Taliban, it's highly likely that we will see more terrorism on the scale of September 11 and even worse.
What do you make of the meeting between Mohammed Atta and an intelligence official in Czechoslovakia?
That's very important. There's another suspected meeting because Atta made 2 trips to the Czech Republic. They were at significant times. The first trip was June 2000, before Atta came to the United States on his first trip to the United States. The second trip, April 2001, looks to be when Atta got the final green light for the operation, because subsequently the muscle men who restrained the passenger and crews come into the United States after that meeting.
So what's the significance? I mean, what do you think went down at that meeting?
I think that Iraqi intelligence gave him directions about how to, proceed with the operation.
You do?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, who was the man who met with Atta?
Iraqi...
A former intelligence official now serving some kind of diplomatic position or not?
Well, yeah, he was in diplomatic position as Ahmed Al-Ani at the Iraqi embassy in Prague. Shortly after the meeting with Atta, he was declared persona non grata and deported by the Czechs.
Because it was an intelligence agent?
Yes, and they believed that he was up to no activity that was no good.
Now, what do you make of these reports that somebody cited this 767 or this big plane on the ground in Iraq, reports, and that it may have been used to train terrorists to pilot the plane?
Well, that's what defectors from Iraqi intelligence have said. The existence of the terrorist training camp is confirmed by UNSCOM. There is, in fact, a picture of the plane. It's a satellite image taken in April 2000. It's in the public domain. I myself put it out on my own email newsletter. Right. And it shows, you can see clearly, there is a plane.
Yeah, right.
And it is sitting really in the middle of nowhere. It's not in an airport. There aren't any other airplanes around.
But that does not suggest or does not prove that it was being used to train terrorists to hijack those planes and pilot them into American.
No, it doesn't prove it, but it corroborates the claim of the defectors.
That there was a plane.
That there was a plane that was people used to train for hijacking.
Tell me what your best guess is as to what the Bush administration will do.
I think that sooner or later there will be war against Iraq. The question that is unclear is whether that war will be to target Iraq's suspected weapon sites, or whether that objective of the war will be to eliminate Saddam and his regime, and it will be declared that Saddam is a state sponsor of terrorism responsible for both Trade Center attacks in New York, and therefore that's the reason why it is intolerable for the United States to leave him in power.
Okay, if you believe Saddam was in charge of both, or directed both, does that mean you have to accept a lesser role by Al-Qaeda? Who's leading whom?
Both are participating. The direction, training, and expertise comes from Iraqi intelligence. Bin Laden provides the ideology, the foot soldiers, and the cover for Iraqi intelligence. So both are involved, but it does mean that unless you eliminate Saddam, you can't stop the terrorism because they'll just do it in a different way.
The war against America. Laurie Mylroie, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.